In this video, we're going to solve a quadratic equation. The problem states, solve x squared equals 10 minus 3x. So we're given a quadratic equation, and as a summary, recap here, there are three main approaches we can use to solve a quadratic equation. The first is to use factoring. The second is to use the square root property. And the third is to use the quadratic formula. These first two approaches are rather fast, but they only work in certain instances. The quadratic formula will work in every case, but takes a little bit more arithmetic to do. There's a fourth approach that involves the square root property, but also something called completing the square that's covered in Math 95. So in this one, we look at those first two options. Can we use factoring? Can we use the square root property? The square root property won't be possible immediately because we don't have an expression that's perfectly squared and a constant only. So we'll try factoring, and if we set it equal to 0 and we can't factor, then our default will be to move on to the quadratic formula. So as a very first step, we want to set this equation equal to 0. So I'll start, and I've got x squared equal to 10 minus 3x. In order to set this equal to 0, I'll need to subtract 10 from each side and add 3x to each side. So that will give me x squared plus 3x minus 10 equal to 0. Now at this point, x squared plus 3x minus 10, I want to think, is that something that I can factor? And that trinomial can be factored. If we look quickly at factor pairs of negative 10, which are the two numbers, we need a product of negative 10, and then we'll need a sum of positive 3 in order to factor this. And if we look at those, what two numbers have a product of negative 10 and a sum of positive 3? Those two numbers are going to be negative 2 and 5. So negative 2 and 5, they have a product of negative 10, a sum of 3. So we can factor this expression into x minus 2 times x plus 5. So we have those two binomials. The product of those is set equal to 0. Now that we have the product of two things set equal to 0, we can use something called the zero product principle. And that tells us that if the product of two things is 0, then either of those could have been 0 to create that product of 0. So we'll end up with x minus 2 equals 0, or x plus 5 equals 0. Solving each of those, these are just linear equations now. X minus 2 equals 0, I add 2 to each side, and I find that x equals 2. With x plus 5 equals 0, I can subtract 5 from each side, and I'll find that x equals negative 5. So now I have two solutions proposed. I can check them, which in general we want to do, and I'll check back into that original equation. So checking positive 2 as a solution, I'm checking does 2 squared equal 10 minus 3 times 2. Simplifying that left side, I'm going to get 4. And on the right side, I'll get 10 minus 6, so indeed that checks. Checking negative 5, I will check when I square negative 5, is that equal to 10 minus 3 times negative 5? Remember that when we square the number negative 5, we take negative 5 times negative 5, which gives us positive 25. So on the left, we have positive 25. And on the right here, we're going to have 10, and we have minus 3 times negative 5, so plus 15, and that checks. Okay, so now we can state our solution set. The two solutions are 2 and negative 5, so we write our solution set as the set containing the number 2 and the number negative 5, and that's written with a curly bracket, 2 comma negative 5, and a second curly bracket. As far as key topics that we want to review, the key topics we're looking for here, we would look for solving quadratic equations. And specifically in this problem, we solved by factoring. So solving quadratic equations, also, so by factoring, or you may have tried the quadratic formula, and that would be, that approach would also work for this problem. It would take a little bit more arithmetic to do, but the quadratic formula would also work. Coming to the ORCA text, which can be found at spot.pcc.edu/math/ORCCA/ORCCA.html. Looking at this textbook, solving quadratic equations is covered in Chapter 8. And solving quadratic equations by factoring is the first section there. If you want to see the quadratic formula, that'd be in section 8.4. So let's recap those real quick. In ORCA, we'd see chapter 8, and specifically sections 8.1 and 8.4.